from the lucid fringe. Ravings from the lucid fringe. Musings from an unpasteurized life. Improvised on the front line of love and beauty. Welcome, I'm Semeric Yarrow. This week on Ravings from the Lucid Fringe, a patchwork of Irish surprises. Expedition to Atlantica, Part 7. Patchwork Counties. Kerry to Tipperary. There are lovely flowers all over the west of Ireland this August. The roads are single lane for the most part, but we manage. We're not in a hurry, thankfully, and it appears that neither is anybody else, certainly not the tractor drivers. Many tractors seem to be driven by boys of about 10, perhaps a little older, but clearly learning their family trade and getting their kicks in the same activity. Elsewhere, I'm told there are definitely mag races around, a la Cape Flats, or Exmouth at night. Some of the land is parcelled out illogically, following centuries of, let's face it, a lot of rural tragedy, usually at the hands of the British and the proto-British before them. The flowers, it turns out, are often invaders too. Red japonicas, orange African irises, and though they're not flowering at this time of year, rhododendrons, all of which thrive in this kind of moist climate. The flowers are on all the verges, and they're occasionally whacked by overprotective landowners with weed killer. Not the best solution to something that dies back annually and is beautiful, even if it's a little excessive at times. On the other hand, I find it a little insane that there are places where the rhododendrons are actually protected, because it's obvious to me as a South African that they are clogging up the natural flow of things, particularly in some of the watercourses. They must be seriously pretty when in flower, for the average bureaucrat to feel justified protecting them, though that's not at this time of year. I guess Ireland has so much water that it hasn't really considered the effects of so many plants from elsewhere, and they're still generally proud of their pretty exotics. We don't see too much actual boggy land this August, but I do hear of some where a local drowned himself some years back. The hidden horrors. Just one set of Irish stories, of which there are so many. It's as if the land offers up story as the human version of flowering. On the west coast, it's chilly, and Inch Beach is not exactly a resort that makes me want to sunbathe. The average summer maximum temperature out here is a pleasant 19 degrees. We are well into the 50s latitudes now, which down south would mean the middle of a cold ocean near Antarctica and not much more. Here, though, we're close to the Gulf Stream that keeps Atlantica unusually warm, so there are some surprising microclimate places where there are tree ferns and palms and other weird tropical things happening. Southwest Ireland has 5 fingers, 5 peninsulas stretching out into the ocean, and we're heading down the one that's furthest north and perhaps most Irish-speaking. In Dingletown there's a Republican monument involving Jesus and Mary, because the Catholic Church here has a somewhat different history to Spain. No right-wing Opus Dei types around here. Instead, the local Catholics were fighting for religious and political freedom. I hear what I think is probably sports commentary pumping out on the Gaelic radio station in the public loo, though which sport I'm not entirely sure. County Kerry is keenest on Gaelic football, and there's a youth team practising on the field one evening opposite the little place in Blennerville where we're staying. Apparently the Kerry men's team just won the All-Ireland final at Croke Park in Dublin, so there are Kerry flags all over the place. Gaelic football involves a goal with a net and a keeper, like soccer, and tall posts, like rugby, which you can also kick points through. Apparently, of the various ball games, it's closest to Australian rules football, and each year there's an Ireland versus Australia World Rules match. The rules for Gaelic football were established by the Gaelic Athletics Association, which turns out to have been a major cultural force 150 years ago, inspiring and pushing for Irish independence. Sporting codes holding matches at Croke Park have to be entirely amateur and entirely not based on British sports rules, and they seem to be impressively popular, if the flags and the cheery messages are anything to go by. Real local hero stuff, warming the heart more than, say, some international soccer player working for a team he has no cultural connection to. It's also in Dingle that we managed to pick up some decent vegetables, which we struggled with the night before. Our accommodation, though, is full of thoughtful little extras and more welcome signs than I've ever seen, extending that Western European notion of excessive numbers of collectibles into an area I hadn't previously considered. This is rather different to what early peoples might have experienced. The south coast of the Dingle Peninsula has a bunch of ring forts, which is again that archaeologist shorthand for not really entirely knowing what they are. Fairy forts is the traditional translation. Belief in the Shia, or fairy folk, has long roots, and why not? There seem to be tales everywhere in Ireland of invisible spirits, including the leprechauns, an equivalent to which is seen regularly in West African initiations and ayahuasca trips, and of course in those who think the little green men they're seeing are aliens from other planets rather than, as I think more likely personally, other dimensions of reality, perhaps what Irish tales look at as the underworld. However, these particular forts are rather solid, dry stone constructions, some of them here on Dingle ridiculously impressive and on the wild edge of nowhere, with goats and sheep and pigs to be petted and fed if you've had enough of the Bronze Age bits. On the other side of the peninsula, around Mount Brandon, which we can't see today in the mist, there's the Gallerus Chapel, or Oratory, the most wonderful dry stone construction. A quote from poet Seamus Heaney tells us what the purpose for the old monks, or other spiritual users of the place, whoever they were, must have been. Going into the still of the dark, the better to appreciate the light on re-entering the world. This, it seems to me, is the point of all these inner temples I've been seeing, ever since the contemplative places of southern Spain, and surely it's the point of the ancient barrows I already saw in England and which Ireland is apparently full of. The links to the ancients continue to grow. Nobody truly knows who built the Gallerus Oratory, but its upside-down boat appearance certainly recalls the more beehive-type structures we already had seen that day, and links this place a little bit to Brendan, the most evocative figure of West Kerry. St. Brendan may or may not have headed off to America in the early days of Irish Christianity. He certainly had an odyssey of journeys, if the epic tales about him are to be believed. I told some of his stories back in my primary school classroom 20 years ago. He evidently was keen to get away from it all, like a lot of these west-facing Peregrino hermit types, a little different to those who instead left Ireland to preach in continental Europe, rousing the ire of popes on what the papacy considered its home territory. Quite probably, Brendan was involved with the monastery on Skellig Michael, that most westerly point of the Sword of Michael arc I previously mentioned, running down through Mont Saint-Michel and on to Israel, which today, rather appropriately, is more famous for the elderly fictional hermit Luke Skywalker. At one point on Dingle we see an impossibly large collection of cars parked. There's a small sign saying this was a location for the Star Wars movie. Maybe so, though not the Skellig Michael scenes. That island is far away, off the next peninsula down, and costs a fat whack of euros to get to, even if the weather's good enough, which it isn't. However, there are always Irish people ready to make money out of gullible US tourists. There's also some dry stones arranged on our route to form sculptures of Yoda and Darth Vader. Ancient times indeed. There are mossy dry stone walls all over the place, and the next really big set I'll see are at the incredible fort on Inishmore that I don't think is a fort at all. Why on earth would people be defending themselves so strongly up on a cliff, far from anywhere, facing the sunset on the western edge of Europe, with an amazing amphitheatre and an ocean backdrop? But a fort is the mainstream archaeological claim for Dun Eonasa, on the largest of the Aran Islands, which I cycled to on another typically misty, rainy day a week later. Being there, sensing the energies swirling, the platform that looks like a stage, the different levels of dry stone building, it's pretty obvious this had some primal spiritual purpose to some people sometime. Who even knows when? You can't carbon date stones. They could have been here for many millennia. My archaeologist friend Matt, who I'd been to Avebury with, prefers working in the recent past these days, so frustrated is he by how much assumption is made by his colleagues about the ancient past. Forts and tombs. So much that I see in Ireland, and have seen in these kinds of sites in England, suggests some people feeling, experiencing, honouring the sun in ways we've kind of forgotten. And of course in the west of Ireland, seeing the sun at all is often rather a blessing, which people comment on endlessly when it comes out. Incongruously near a riding school with fancy grounds, we find a few Ogham stones by some ferns in the rain. These tend to be ancient standing stones that have been carved with old Irish language text that has a complex numbered notch-based alphabet, often declaring ownership or sometimes something a little more Christian. We saw one in the museum at Ardfurt's ruined cathedral, and another one with a rather phallic cap in a graveyard in the south of County Cork. The story Paul Kingsnorth repeats about that one is that you're supposed to put the cap on your head to cure a headache, which seems like an Irish kind of yarn. There are loads of other standing stones in Ireland too that still seem to be in their original positions. Like, really a lot. We find more another day on the Beara Peninsula further south. On this occasion the sun is out enough for us to take it all in, a magnificent landscape for grounded spiritual experiences. 5 stones arranged at different angles to the earth, allowing space for interacting with the surroundings. There's a fresh loch nearby to dip into, and blue dragonflies and butterflies and natural silence. We'd driven down there via the Killarney National Park, which was a different thing entirely. A beautiful waterfall, a forested hill walk with rowans sticking out between the beeches, hollies and oaks. I'm gradually getting the hang of these northern trees. But also plenty of people who are otherwise largely absent in this peaceful part of the world. The national park and the Killarney area felt familiar. Killarney is twinned with Keswick in the English Lake District, and there were lakes and holiday excursions and a place called Ladies' View, where Victorian ladies would once have stopped to take a look. It was all rather magnificent, yet it was also more manicured than on Beara. We would really have had to head far into the mountains, I think, to escape the day trip crowds. And in the heart was Muck Ross House. We didn't visit it, but it sounds like exactly the kind of place that marked the Protestant ascendancy, when Anglo-Irish lords were in charge of big houses across the country. Perhaps it was owned by a Lord and Lady Muck. There's a range of rather different and smaller big houses popping up now, it seems, often attributed to local councillors and other bigwigs in the new Ireland. The edge of Beara takes you out to wild rocks left in place. My sense driving around there is that the land itself calls to remain wild, to force us into accepting her as she is. There's a Buddhist retreat centre out there, with a view out to the south, to County Cork, and the Sheep's Head Peninsula that is the next finger down. And on this long summer evening there are Irish people sitting in shorts outside their local pub at the end of nowhere, pretending they're in a warm Spanish street perhaps. Shame, man. We drive north, back to Blennerville, and its very indoor pub, a great place to get a velvety pint of Guinness before bed. One cliché I'm happy to acknowledge is that Guinness does taste better in Ireland. Must be something about the water. Tralee, which Blennerville is just outside, is a student town, and there are a number of Indonesian students in tonight who order something I'd forgotten existed, Snakebite and black. Black currant cordial to sweeten half a pint of lager and half a pint of fizzy cider. That would definitely be the kind of thing to take the edge off any romantic notions of oldie Ireland. Blennerville's main attraction, however, is Ireland's biggest working mill. It's not working when we visit because the wind is too strong, actually, but we do climb up all 4 floors and look at the big greasy cogs and wheels, the swing mechanism that moves the sails to face the wind, the pulleys that lift the bags. Our guide, a fast-talking local who switches into swift Irish to chat to the girl from Dublin, who's part of the trip too, talks of how dangerous mills were, with flammable flour dust causing many to rip into flame, and no emergency exits. Charming. Blennerville is not exactly an old Irish name. The Anglo-Irish landlord round here wanted to make money from grain. The exhibition has a section on the famine, and in particular the graveyard ships that took many escaping Ireland for the USA, except that they were often overcrowded sources of deadly epidemics. The ones from Blennerville, by contrast, were at least known for having qualified doctors, decent conditions, and never lost passengers. Which is lovely, except for the genocidal famine they were escaping from, of course. In many places we see famine cottages listed as tourist attractions, old Irish homes left abandoned. It's rather gruesome, but the trauma still haunts the land and the culture of the people, it seems, nearly 2 centuries later. Meanwhile, there's a rather random, to my mind, room full of model railways, which, as we've seen before, seem to be following me round on this trip. English enthusiasts have created a reconstruction of the old Dingle Railway and donated it as one of the items on display. A guy seems to be mostly employed to keep this whole thing operational. Playing with toy trains for a living is quite a thing to put on your CV. Ardfert Cathedral up the road, founded by St Brendan the Adventurer, is one of the first churches we look at on this island, and perhaps the most common type, a historical ruin. Surprising perhaps in a Catholic country where until very recently the church had an enormous hold on social attitudes, but then there have been so very many changes of power over the years. New groups would build their own churches once the previous ones had been tainted, perhaps. Holy orders would come in and out of favour based on the capricious whim of temporarily powerful rulers. Ardfert suffered, it seems, not particularly because of English or Viking incursions, but because Ireland was already a bunch of kingdoms and clans that liked to wage war with each other, and sometimes churches got in the way. On the Dingle Peninsula we'd seen a churchyard around the shell of a medieval church, and plenty of Celtic crosses. I'd first seen these decades ago on Iona, the island that held a Celtic monastery, not far from the Irish coast, but part of Scotland. These contained beautiful Celtic knot patterns and a circle surrounding the centre of the cross, part of Celtic and Coptic Christianity, and marking it out as Catholic but not quite Roman. In Ardfert there are plenty of these as well, we're told, as the remains of a round tower. These standalone bell towers were part of early Irish Christian history, before the coming of the Anglo-Normans, that first serious bunch of English overlords. We see more ruins of the former Dominican priory in Kilmallock later that day. The sun is shining, and the big arched windows through which we see into the world are full of the mood of the late afternoon. There was power here once. It's a different kind of power now. Kilmallock also has an old map up showing the walled town and the Irish town beyond. Anglo-Normans came in and set up shop and kept the barbarian, Irish-speaking locals to the outskirts, in a ghetto in their own country. South African apartheid townships were clearly first tried out as an idea centuries ago in Ireland by a different group of cultural minority settlers facing a network of tribes that struggled to unite against them. The truth of what we see at Kilmallock, though, is of the fragile nature of local power over the centuries. There's what we think is a castle tower in the centre of the town. It turns out to be a merchant's house. For centuries, those who had a bit of economic might and wanted to hold on to it built draughty castles for themselves. There are hundreds of ruins of these kinds of things around the country. Security first. South Africa's wealthy owners of enclaves with razor wire and multiple gates could also probably see themselves in this kind of thing. And clearly, in the end, it was lost. Not least because the Anglo-Normans largely went feral, falling in love with the Irish, learning the language, and for centuries merging into their new homes, rather than propping up the English state abroad. Literally, they went beyond the Pale, which was the name for the solid English territory near Dublin. This is of course exactly what the Norman aristocrats were doing in England too. In the 14th century, at last, they stopped speaking French and learnt the local tongue. There was for a while an equivalent Irish-speaking Norman aristocracy here, until that ex-Viking, ex-Norman, newly almost British arrogance kicked in once more. It's at Cashel the next day that this part of the story all comes into sharp focus. It's cold, and the wind is biting, and there's a bit of drizzle, and frankly, for all the drama of its looming appearance on the landscape, once we get there I can see why the holiest Christian site in Ireland might have been abandoned eventually. And that's even without the grotesque massacre carried out by the parliamentarians back in the War of the Three Kingdoms. Part of that war was the English Civil War, but it actually involved multiple wars in Ireland and Scotland too. The Protestant leader of the massacre, the same guy who destroyed the Dominican priory we'd seen in Kilmallock, ironically converted to Catholicism some years later. Cashel is dramatic and has all the aforementioned architectural bits: cathedral open to the sky, round tower, royal chapel, which we couldn't go in because its murals are apparently too fragile to cope with lots of tourists' breath, a bishop's tall defensive castle to keep him safe as a wealthy landowner in uncertain times, and a bunch of buildings around it too. Here's the story, too, of the only ever English Pope, Adrian IV, basically giving the English king, Henry II, the right to be Lord of Ireland, so that the Catholics could gain a solid foothold against local Celtic Christian autonomy. Irish history seems to be of repeated betrayal by foreigners looking to grasp the territory. But it's also full of gnarly independent rural folk ignoring the rules. That's perhaps what keeps being refreshing to learn about as we travel around this island, and has clearly been seductive over the centuries to those who've come in on behalf of some ruler or other. Sure, there's Brian Boru, who pops up all over the place as the one actually Irish High King exception that proves the rule, the one big fighter against Vikings and their mixed Norse-Gaelic descendants around Dublin, their capital, after whose death Irish politics became patchwork again, as they would continue to be, and as the fractured architecture we're seeing keeps suggesting. On the way down from the rock, there's a young guy playing brilliant fiddle, and further down still there's a young harpist who is playing lovely melodies herself. Both very Irish, you can hear it, both very different. We head for a cup of tea and a scone to get out of the wind for a while. This is County Tipperary, and now there are Tipperary flags everywhere, for it turns out that their men's team just won the other great Croke Park match, the All-Ireland hurling final. I watch a replay with my Irish friend a week later. It's classic end-to-end stuff, with goals and posts, like in Gaelic football, but this time being a kind of variation on hockey that looks a bit like a psychedelic egg and spoon race. Needless to say, they wear helmets because those balls and sticks look pretty deadly. It's kind of high-speed Quidditch. And once again, all amateur, and only played round here. Though when looking up the results I come across an article saying that hurling is taking off in Brittany, who are keen for rediscovering Celtic sports, even ones like this that only got formalised in the 1880s. I'll see some live hurling on TV while waiting for the ferry back from Inishmore, except it's actually camogie, because for some reason the women's version of the same game has a different name. Go figure. We're staying on a dairy cattle farm in the middle of Tipperary, and I help the farmer with milking when we get back from our day's outing. A black and white cat called, COVID, is hanging around waiting for some of that white gold. Our host reveals that if we'd stayed one night longer we could have gone to the local weekly music session with him. It sounds like a crack at which we would have been welcomed despite not being experts in local styles. But the lively sounds from the musicians on the rock are still ringing. I'm happy to wait a while more before I try and play any such styles of music myself. Goddesses and Fiddles. Deeper into Ireland. A fat bird with a yellow head nods at me. Perhaps he's a messenger from spirit. We're walking around the grounds at Loch Gur, County Limerick, while Knockadoon Hill stares at us on the other side of the waters. She's a powerful goddess, Anya, who rules this lake, and she claims a human every 7 years, it is said, including the 3rd Earl of Desmond, who rides around it as one of the undead, apparently after trying, back in the 14th century, to make laws that would force the Anglo-Normans to stop mixing with the native Irish. An early promoter, therefore, of a kind of apartheid, getting his comeuppance at the hands of the land. The signposts on our walk are here to make you think, to make you breathe, to connect with the creative spirit of this place in the middle of the Green Island. It's a great way to get moving again, after our visit to Leos na Grancy, the Stones of the Sun. Ireland's largest stone circle has well over 100 stones and makes for a beautiful solstice-aligned terrain, ideal for dance or other kinds of festivity or just the peace of a late afternoon. And so it should become again, surely. This was once a place of many tribes, many communities, living in networks, even though they also fought amongst themselves. Stones also make music. Lithophones, they're called. The different harmonies of the stones is interesting to ponder. Who called them to come together like this? Which artists listened to the stones themselves and arranged them in their desired patterns? Nearer to Loch Gur there's a mossy, crumbled barrow, a smaller version of the types I'd seen in England, where apparently an old woman lived in the 19th century still. She'd have to have been hardy. It's a few rocks brought together, better for a temporary experience of the dark than a beehive hut. And even those beehive huts on Skellig Michael would have been pretty intense ascetic experiences, surviving through the winter on seagull eggs and seaweed. We find an even smaller set in a field the next day, impossible to reach but clearly brought together for some purpose. Loch Gur has lots of evidence of ancient settlement. Besides the obvious spiritual sites, there's ordinary square foundations stretching back for millennia. Another time, and another set of our human incarnations, but the land has been here the whole time. More recent landowners have had other plans, though. The loch is beautiful, but it used to be bigger until 19th century improvements. We'd earlier passed through Adair, where the day crowds were packing the streets. It was a public holiday, so not that surprising. The planned village with twee-thatched houses was one lord of the manor's idea of creating an ascetic legacy, I guess. Then there's Cahir, a little further south. A spectacular medieval castle with more white ducks in the stream around it than I've seen in one place before. Grand rooms and power past. A working drawbridge and a dungeon, more on the French model. Donjon basically means castle keep, so an above-ground stronghold, for keeping noble prisoners in the state to which they were accustomed. One big exhibition recounts the role this place played in the Elizabethan period, during the Great War the English fought then on Irish territory. Hugh O'Neill was the main Irish lord who turned on the Elizabethans. The Earl of Essex came and took this castle at one point, which also has nice townhouse windows from one stage of its long history. And when O'Neill was finally defeated, he also led the Flight of the Lords, where the old Gaelic-speaking aristocracy fled to the continent. It was after that that the plantation of Ulster by Scottish Protestants began, as well as the granting of land to new Anglo-Irish nobles down in the south. I won't get to the 6 counties of Northern Ireland on this trip, but parts of the Protestant history of the south are also new to me. We crossed the Blackwater River in County Waterford to reach Lismore Castle, a very different kind of faux ancient pile, which still belongs to the Duke of Devonshire. It's a little disconcerting to learn that the sovereign state of Ireland still has an English aristo showing off round here and fencing in his private turf, but not completely unexpected. Empires die slowly, even if revolutions happen fast. With all these transitions, it's interesting to consider together the various churches we've seen that aren't ancient or full of holes. We passed a very grand one in Killarney, which turns out to be a neo-Gothic number designed by Pugin, one of those famous Victorian architect types, inspired by the ruins at Ardfert. The Killarney one now belongs to the Catholics, as does the one we saw in Kilmallock. That church, with harmonious Byzantine-style mosaics and elegant windows, reminded me of the equally Catholic church we visited 2 years ago in Dresnica in the Slovenian Alps. Beautiful, colourful, airy, and a sign of a religion with money whenever it's not being squashed. Think about it. Landowners of even a couple of generations tend to have money to spare. The Catholic Church has been a landowner for about 1800 years, not counting what it inherited directly from the Roman Empire. Even if it had had the worst money managers in the world, it must have a fair packet to spend. However, my favourite is the cathedral here in Lismore, which still belongs to the Church of Ireland. The Church of Ireland is a bit of a bizarre anachronism, really. Its main cathedral and archbishop are up in the often Protestant north in Armagh. It's part of the Church of England. In other words, it's the Anglican Protestant relic from the time when all the landowners were Anglo-Irish guys, or even just plain Anglo like the Duke of Devonshire. They invested money in things like their very own big churches, back when the ordinary Irish were heavily discriminated against if they dared to be Catholic worshippers. St Carthage's Cathedral here in Lismore is another lovely bit of Victorian neo-Gothic, with very fine roof bosses that look straight out of the arts and crafts movement. That's because they are. William Morris was involved in the design, and the Pre-Raphaelites are here too, because Edward Burne-Jones designed the main stained glass window on the way in. There's a photo outside of him and Morris looking quite the Bohemians. So it's all rather attractively done, whoever the congregation actually still is these days, besides the Devonshires when they're in town, presumably. There's also an important injunction above the pulpit, presumably in relation to all this, as well as to life in general. It just says, "Laugh." The blackberries are by now virtually falling off all the brambles. It's a pleasant afternoon for another green stroll. We pass a bunch of teenage girls sticking together on the footpaths and chatting enthusiastically. Life in rural Ireland has its own busyness and its own quaint safety. One friend tells of an unexpected visit from the local police. The cops were trying to find out who owned a bicycle which they'd found left unattended and wanted to return. Some villages have police stations which operate on, say, Thursday afternoons, if you're lucky, when a member of the Garda decides to come through and open up. Possibly the young lads who were roguishly digging up a weirdly protected rhododendron on another path this morning would have had the Garda to answer to, but quite possibly not. That was on our way out of Tipperary, climbing another lovely set of lowish peaks. Down below one viewpoint, a mother tells her young son to look at the single tree left standing in a field. "That's a fairy tree," she says. I can well believe it. We drive further south into County Cork and to a village with a well dedicated to the local saint, who's so local nobody really knows much about him except that he had an unsaintly argument with the next saint along. But the locals go round the well on special occasions to get good luck. They also put cloths in the hawthorn nearby. These cloths remind me suspiciously of prayer ties made for sweat lodges. We're dealing with old embodied spirituality here, whatever clothes and stories it's covered in. The local graveyard is full of rocks. Well, of standing stones, really, that I'm sure were here first. One more exploratory drive. We head for Kinsale, a stylish port town with bookshops and original cafes and Spanish-style balconies and customs houses and colour. That's where the Irish Catholics really hoped the Spanish Armada would be a success, and it wasn't. So there's also forts set up for the British kings that followed. This is the story English schoolchildren could perhaps also learn, not just Elizabeth I, the plucky resister of Philip II, but Elizabeth the coloniser, with the Irish forever urging on the other side, like they'd do later during the French Revolution. In Blennerville there was a monument to Robert Emmet, the leader of a doomed rebellion when Napoleon was fighting the Brits, which was about the time the local Irish Parliament, never a very democratic institution, was completely abolished by Westminster. In Cork, however, there's a monument raised by the Young Ireland Society and celebrating all the rebels and nationalist leaders of the past. This is pretty impressive because it's in the middle of the city between the two fine rivers we cross at sunset, and because it was put up in 1906, when the British were definitely still supposed to be in charge. We don't really have time to explore much of Cork life, but an evening out gives you a taste of the Republic's second and southernmost city. There's a very grand-looking cathedral next to a place called Sober Street, ambitiously enough. Today it has at least one bar on it. The theatre scene looks like it's buzzing, which isn't surprising given what I know of Ireland's playwrights. One popular play features 18th century English land surveyors anglicising all the place names. Heavy irony, though also useful for those of us foreigners trying to find our way around, so for practical purposes I'm perhaps a little on the fence. At least there's bilingual road signs these days, so everyone can see their way from Corker to Boyle Alt Clia, Dublin. We enter two pubs that are holding sessions. One is full of players and sounds great, although people still chat loudly around them and the style is a little predictable. That's probably because there's so many players. The more original session is next door with just 3 guys taking part, but both are quite magical to be present to, including singing, Ilian pipes, fiddles, accordions or concertinas, flutes and whistles, bouzouki and guitars, even mauron drums played with a little taste and decorum and without dominating proceedings. I will hear a lot more of this further north in County Clare over the next days. It's great to get a sense and a taste. The stout tastes different in Cork too, Murphy's and Beamish's rather than Guinness. Alcohol, music and sport seem to be the main sources of regional pride in the evenings in Ireland, and there's definitely a lot of the former. Food, less so. We have a fairly average fancy meal at an Irish restaurant. Home-cooked country food is more where things are at still, and there's plenty of that to be had at least. My father boards a plane. I board a bus, and then another one for the next part of my Irish adventure. I'm actually not quite watching where I need to get off the first one, and the driver takes me back remarkably kindly when the other passengers got off. The second takes me up to Ennis, the small county town of Clare, one of the biggest and most rural of the counties in a country that is already very rural. On the way, I catch a glimpse of Limerick, where a friend teaches in the apparently wonderful ethnomusicology department. In a perhaps very Irish example of odd rules, although he's learnt his trade in other parts of the world, he can only teach it because he also holds an Irish passport. An Asian expert on Asian music, according to this logic, would be unable to teach there without being a dual citizen. There are also music colleges outside of the mainstream tertiary system, like there were in the south of Spain, places where Irish music can be really delved into and new performers trained. Though many of them train at home, actually, with much of the particular variations in the music still passed down in families and villages. Tonight I'm heading, though, in the company of Norman, my old friend and colleague, to the Fecal Festival, a wonderful gathering of musicians in the middle of not much. One of the hidden gems of Central Ireland. There is a more than full crowd in the local church for the big Friday night concert, which features the extraordinary fiddle playing of Martin Harvey. The journey I go on with these styles takes me deep into a rich musical odyssey with all kinds of emotional highs and surprising depths along the way. The framework involves subtle changes of pace and often dramatic and virtuoso finales. He plays with two other grand musicians who hold the ship together and sometimes take the lead, and the whole night involves other young experts. One young woman sings in Gaelic and then sings in English, a ballad of deep pain after one of the lost battles back in the 17th century, but still providing an anchor for sorrow. There's a contrast here with the young woman I saw in Granada in the south of Spain. She had been playing her own styles, influenced by the wonderful contributions of her peninsula to world music, but forging something very personal. Here, this woman is tapping into something more archetypal, more of the land and its stories and its songs. We also go to a song sharing where people of many ages and from many counties stand up and sing solo. We hear old tunes from different landscapes in the country, some long ones telling old stories, and some newer ones, even some originals. Some of the songs are wonderfully entertaining, others seem more personally cathartic to let out. There's humour. One is about a hurling team in their 70s. Another about the fact that Moses was advised by an Irishman. That's why the Egyptian river is O'Nile. Badum tish. Nearby, there are other sessions in other locations. Everyone's got an instrument. Beside a stream, some are accompanying the water with their whistles and learning a tune. It's all rather far from the eyes of the state. Indeed, a famous secret meeting between Protestant clergy and the then illegal Provisional Irish Republican Army took place here in Fecal in the early 1970s, in a talks-about-talks kind of way before the Garda were tipped off. There are interesting-looking camper vans all over the place, which seems to be the new thing to do in the European summer. I mean, I remember caravans as a kid, but now it's almost become a lifestyle. New gypsies. There were definitely places in France where I saw people parked frequently, and down at the Clare coast there are huge numbers of them too. One friend of mine remembers camping with tents in an Irish summer, and the sheer likelihood of precipitation made it something he wouldn't recommend. By contrast, I guess this is glamping on the move. Ireland has travellers too, who aren't really the same as the Romany people, though they're often confused. Many of them were forced to settle in housing locations in recent decades, but they've got a roaming history and often larger families than the average, and you might find more of them, I guess, on the edge of these kinds of festival. My friends have a small holding. Until recently they had pigs roaming free, who are now in the freezer, and they have a pony on loan, quite the best form of lawnmower. There are apples in extraordinary abundance on their trees, and pears, and other fruits taking root with the mild weather and the rain. We eat ice cream with raspberry sauce, all local. A neighbour with an apple press is going to take it into the village for a day, so that the other locals can all use it too. It's a community, even if it's hard work in the country and there's always something to be done. We take the dogs for a walk beside another lake, through woodland. My friend points out the mother trees, part of a new understanding that trees aren't all competing against each other but have nodes of cooperation. Our view on nature is evolving from that outdated Victorian paradigm of winner takes all. Now we just need that understanding to feed back into our own economic sphere. A rainy morning for a drive down towards the Burren. That's the limestone landscape of the west of Clare, which continues onto the Aran Islands. Looking at photos from above, I think it looks like a Formica counter that's peeling, but the reality is far more atmospheric. The crossing is quite gentle today, and afterwards we get on our bikes. My friend keeps up with me despite being 20 years older because he's using an e-bike up the slopes, a heavy but intriguing new invention. I'm just glad to be back on a saddle, and we tour around the ruins and take in a little thick soup from a Gaelic-speaking cafe. There are strange vertical tombs on Inishmore that look a bit like filing cabinets made of stone. There are also lots and lots of dry stone walls crisscrossing the landscape. One wonders what for, often. But the most obvious reason is to get the limestone out of the way so that animals could graze. Great markers head out into the limestone platforms, though. One of these I find very useful when needing somewhere to hide behind for a pee far from any conveniences. Besides the extraordinary Dune Eonasa I talked about earlier, which takes dry stone temple building to the next level, there's strange things like the Wormhole, a gigantic natural swimming pool with deep square sides and waves crashing inside it as it's right next to the sea, but a few nutters apparently compete with dives into it at times. On another day, I might have tried one of the beaches on the east side rather. The regularity of it makes one wonder if giants or spirits or older humans with different technologies actually carved this out. Or maybe it's just the goddesses of the land having fun with our speculating minds. A journey home and the evening sun takes us to Scariff, a slightly larger village nearby on the edge of another loch, and where the local bric-a-brac saleswoman is apparently the main official that will stamp your documents for you. It's all very gentle and very beautiful. Claire has been good to me, but it's time to move on. I jump on a packed local train on a surprisingly warm summer morning and adventure up in the direction of Galway, the capital of the West Coast. There I can wander through the busy town and note the number of statues that are appearing dedicated to writers. And I can hear the buskers, one of whom is blasting out some Carlos Santana lines. There's also a puppeteer with his musician puppet playing the cello, the first musical street puppets I've seen since Seville. The truth is that the wonderful musical heritage that Ireland has preserved is also accompanied by the more recent interactions with the mainstream popular world. Ask most people for the name of an Irish band and they'll say U2. And then the Irish diaspora is an important part of who the Irish are. They have spread into the world, particularly the English language dominant parts, including South Africa of course, quite as much as the other world travellers of Atlantica. The Galway pedestrian zone displays plenty of confidence, though the sun is shining on this August day, enough for the street cafes to look authentic and the Green Park to be a delicious place to stop. It's my birthday, so I buy an Irish whistle for myself. That at least will fit in my Ryanair case in the end. This particular journey is cruising to an end, but there's still one more leg to go as I climb aboard another bus north. So, thank you for listening to this latest episode in the series, and you can find all of my articles and my recordings at lucidfringe.substack.com, except my music and poetry from the past, which is all available at simrickyarrow, all one word, .bandcamp.com, and the background recordings and sounds that you will have heard are all either from those recordings or they are my own. Please do give this a rating if it's on your podcast app. Please spread the word if you enjoy what you hear, and if you want to give me some feedback or commentary, of course I'm very open to that. Any suggestions for future episodes